Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yawp online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 8 of the American Yawp is called The Early Republic. It covers the election of 1800, Jefferson's presidency, the Louisiana Purchase, the rise of Tecumseh's Confederation, and the War of 1812. It is, in other words, the chapter where the United States starts to figure out what kind of country it intends to be. Today we're going to spend our time in Virginia. We're going to follow two men. They never met, although they lived only a few counties apart, and they reached the same conclusion about the country they were living in, and they tried, in completely different ways, to do something about it. One of them you will not find in the chapter at all. The other one you will, but the American Yawp only gives him a paragraph of attention. His name is Gabriel. It is the summer of 1800. Gabriel is walking the road into Richmond, Virginia. He is 24 years old, born the same year as the country he is walking through. He is 6'2", broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that makes a room reorganize itself when he enters. He is also literate, which most enslaved men in Virginia are not. He is also a blacksmith, which means his enslaver, Thomas Prosser, rents him out by the day. However, Gabriel keeps a portion of what he earns. But Gabriel keeps something more important than the money. He keeps the ability to move. Every Sunday that summer, he walks the road from Prosser's plantation into Richmond. He has reasons to be there. He has tools to deliver, work to pick up, conversations to have. He uses his time. He notes the location of the Capitol building and the arsenal where the city's weapons are stored. He notes the penitentiary as well as which streets connect to which, where the militia drills, where the bridges are, and who is paying attention. He is making a map. The plan he is building is enormous. He has spent months quietly talking to other men, his brothers, Solomon and Martin, and a man named Jack Bowler. And from there outward through 10 Virginia counties and the cities of Richmond, Petersburg, and Norfolk. Hundreds of men, by some estimates, close to 1,000. The plan is this. On a Saturday night in late August, 3 columns of armed men will converge on Richmond, Virginia. The first will gather at Brook Bridge, 6 miles outside the city. The second will move on the Capitol and the magazine. The third will set a diversionary fire at a tobacco warehouse district along the river to pull the city's attention away from the assault. They will take Governor James Monroe hostage. They will hold the capital city, and they will negotiate with the gun in their hand for the end of slavery in Virginia. The weapons are being made in Brookfield itself. Gabriel and his brother Solomon are blacksmiths. They take scythe blades, the curved farm tools used to cut wheat, and they cut them in half, sharpen them, and fix them to handles. By the end of the summer, they have made roughly 150 of them, crude swords forged from tools of agricultural labor. They have also cast about 500 musket balls and a stockpile of 50 spears. There is a flag, or there will be, on the night of the rebellion. Gabriel has set aside money to buy a piece of silk. The words on it will read, "Death or Liberty." Now, here's the thing about Gabriel's plan that almost no textbook tells you. Gabriel expected white allies. He was not planning a race war. He had grown up in Virginia, where poor white workers, French and German immigrants, and Methodists and Quakers and free black laborers all worked side by side along the Richmond docks. He believed many of them shared his grievances, even if not his condition. His orders to his men were specific. When the uprising began, they were to spare Methodists, Quakers, and Frenchmen. They were to spare the poor. They were to strike at the Federalists, the merchants, the planters, the men at the top of the racial and economic hierarchy of Virginia. At least 2 white men, probably French, appear in the trial records as participants in the planning. Gabriel imagined a multiracial revolt against the men who ran his world. He believed Virginia was ready. The date he chose was Saturday, August 30th of 1800. It started raining that afternoon. It did not stop. By evening, it was a downpour, the likes of which Henrico County had not seen in years. Roads turned to mud. Creeks rose. Brook Bridge, where his men were supposed to gather, was washed out before most of them could even reach it. The communication network Gabriel had built collapsed under the weather. Men who were supposed to be marching were stranded on the wrong side of flooded rivers. That alone might not have been the end of it. Easy, they could reschedule. But 2 men on a plantation called Meadow Farm, owned by Mosby Shepherd, decided that afternoon they did not want to die for Gabriel's plan. Their names were Tom and Pharaoh. They told their enslaver what was coming. Mosby Shepherd wrote a letter to Governor Monroe. By the time the storm broke, the militia was already mobilizing. Gabriel ran. He made it down to Norfolk, where he tried to board a boat and disappear. Unfortunately, he was recognized there by another enslaved man who turned him in for the reward. The reward had been advertised as $300. The man was paid $50. They brought Gabriel back to Richmond in chains. Governor Monroe interviewed him personally before the trial. Monroe was 38 years older than the young man across the table from him. He would later become the 5th president of the United States. He wrote afterward that Gabriel seemed to have made up his mind to die and to have resolved to say but little. That was all Monroe got from him. The trials began in September and continued in waves through the fall. Under Virginia law, insurrection cases were tried by a court of oyer and terminer. 5 judges, no jury. A unanimous verdict required for conviction. Dozens of men passed through that courtroom before it was over. We do not have Gabriel's own words from the trial. He gave them almost nothing. But an Englishman named Robert Sutcliffe, traveling through Virginia 4 years later, wrote down what a lawyer who had been present at the trials told him. One of Gabriel's men, asked what he had to say in his own defense, stood up and said this:
I have nothing more to offer than what General Washington would have had to offer had he been taken by the British and put to trial by them. I have adventured my life in endeavoring to obtain the liberty of my countrymen, and am a willing sacrifice in their cause. I beg, as a favor, that I may be immediately led to execution.
The defense, the only defense any of them offered, was the language of the men sitting in judgment of them. They hanged Gabriel on October 10th of 1800. He was the last of at least 26 men executed for the uprising. Some were sold out of state, some were pardoned. A handful escaped before sentencing. We do not know exactly how many died. The Virginia legislators spent the months that followed passing laws. Restrictions on free black movement, restrictions on the education of enslaved people, prohibitions on assembly without white supervision. However, that is the part of the story we're going to come back to later. Welcome to our special segment. We're calling this one The Other Answer. Now, I want to introduce you to a man who reached the same conclusion as Gabriel from the opposite end of the social order at almost the same moment. His tools were completely different, but his story is almost unknown. On the morning of September 5th, 1791, a clerk at the Northumberland District Court in Virginia opened a document like he had never seen before. It had been delivered by a man named Robert Carter III, a wealthy planter from nearby Westmoreland County. The document was several pages long. Most of those pages were a list of names. The clerk read down the columns. 452 names, each one paired with an age sorted from youngest to oldest, and a Roman numeral indicating on which of Carter's plantations the person lived. The document was titled, in Carter's own hand, A Deed of Gift. After the names, in a few short paragraphs, Carter explained what he was doing. I have for some time been convinced that to retain them in slavery is contrary to the true principles of religion and justice, and that therefore it was my duty to manumit them. He had spent months working out the legal mechanics. Virginia had passed a manumissions law in 1782, allowing slaveholders to free enslaved people without government permission. Carter had read it very carefully. He intended to use every provision of it. His plan was gradual. Beginning the next January and every January after that, 15 enslaved adults on his lands would be freed, starting with the oldest. Younger people would be freed automatically when they reached the age of adulthood, 21 for men, 18 for women. The 30 people on his lands who were already over 45 years old, considered elderly under the law, would be freed immediately and allowed to remain on his property for the rest of their lives. When the process was complete, it would take 21 years. By then, more than 500 people would walk free. It was the largest private emancipation in American history. Before the Civil War, no one would attempt anything close to it. Now, here is where we should pause for a second and talk about who Robert Carter III actually was. He was not a fringe figure. He was not a religious eccentric living on the edge of Virginian society. His grandfather was Robert Carter I, known to his contemporaries as King Carter, one of the largest slaveholders and slave traders in Virginia's colonial history. The Carter family had been among the most powerful families in the colony for nearly a century. Robert Carter III had inherited 16 plantations, some of them named after the signs of the zodiac. He had sat on the governor's council. He had dined with George Washington. He had loaned money to Thomas Jefferson. He owned a library that rivaled Jefferson's own. He was, by every measure, a Virginia gentleman of the highest order. He had also, somewhere in the decade before the Deed of Gift, decided that the entire system that he had inherited was wrong. The decision did not arrive all at once. He had converted from the Anglican Church to the Baptist faith in 1778, joining a small congregation called Morintico Baptist, which seated white and black, free and enslaved, in the same room. He had read widely. He had watched the Revolution unfold and listened to the language it used about liberty. And by the mid-1780s, he was making decisions that did not fit any pattern his neighbors recognized. In 1786, he sent his two youngest sons, ages 9 and 13, to the College of Rhode Island, what we now call Brown University. He paid for their education. He arranged for their lodging, and he barred them from returning to Virginia until they were adults. The reason he gave in his own letters was that he did not want them shaped by slavery. He wanted them educated somewhere that did not have it. When their mother died in 1787, he didn't even allow them to come home for her funeral. By 1791, he was ready. He drafted the Deed of Gift, he carried it to the Northumberland courthouse himself, and he filed it. The response in Virginia was almost silence. A short notice ran in the Virginia Gazette and General Advertiser at the end of September. Otherwise, the document was barely acknowledged in the public press. Carter's friends did not write to congratulate him. His neighbors did not host receptions. The men he had served with on the governor's council did not follow his example. His own family was less restrained. Some of his adult children began openly opposing him. By 1793, Carter had concluded that his eldest son, John Tasker Carter, who was running the Nomini Hall estate, could not be trusted to carry out the manumission process after his death. So Carter wrote a new arrangement. He leased the estate to his son, but placed control of the freed people and the ongoing manumissions in the hands of a Baptist minister named Benjamin Dawson. He did not trust his son to free his enslaved people. He trusted his minister. Meanwhile, Carter started leasing his own land back to the people he had already freed. By 1797, several of his plantations were occupied entirely by formerly enslaved Virginians working their own farms, earning their own income, and paying him rent. When white renters came to him for land, he turned them away in favor of the people he had once held in bondage. Robert Carter III died in 1804. Within months of his death, his family went to court. They filed an injunction in Frederick County, attempting to stop the remaining manumissions. The case worked its way up the Virginia legal system to the Court of Appeals. The court ruled against the family. The deed of gift held. The manumissions continued year after year until 1812, 8 years after Carter was buried. The full count by then was somewhere between 500 and 600 men, women, and children walking free. Robert Carter III is not in your textbook. The Yawp does not mention him at all in Chapter 8. There's no monument at Nomini Hall. There's no Carter Memorial Highway. Most American history students will graduate from high school and then from college having never heard his name. I want you to pause and think about that for a moment. Not as an accusation against anyone, just as a fact. The largest private emancipation in American history before the Civil War was carried out by a Virginia planter, a friend of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. In the same decade, those two men were declining to do anything comparable. History remembered them, but forgot Robert Carter. Two men, same state, same decade. Both reached the same conclusion about slavery in Virginia and tried to do something about it. Both, in their own way, still lost. In the years right after the American Revolution, Virginia was not the Virginia most of us imagine when we think of the Old South. The tobacco economy was struggling. The soil was exhausted. Many planters were quietly questioning whether slavery was even economically viable anymore. The language of liberty had been everywhere for 2 decades. Some of the men who had signed the Declaration had openly described slavery as a moral problem. In 1782, the Virginia legislature passed an act that allowed private manumission for the first time in nearly a century. You could, if you wanted to, free the people you held in bondage. You did not need permission from the state. You just had to make legal arrangements for their support. Manumissions began to climb. Quaker congregations across the state freed enslaved people in significant numbers. Methodist circuits did the same. The free black population of Virginia rose from roughly 2,000 people in 1782 to about 13,000 by 1800. In 1796, a respected Virginia jurist named George Tucker published a treatise proposing a plan for the gradual abolition of slavery in the state. He sent it to the legislature. The window was open, and then it closed. It closed because 3 things happened in less than 10 years. The first was technology. In 1793, a young Yale graduate named Eli Whitney, visiting a Georgia plantation, designed a simple machine that could mechanically separate cotton fiber from its seed. The cotton gin made short staple cotton enormously profitable. Within a decade, cotton production in the United States went from a few thousand pounds per year to many millions. And the new cotton economy needed laborers. Slavery, which some Virginians had been calling unprofitable, suddenly became one of the most lucrative economic systems in the world. The second was the Haitian Revolution. Starting in 1791 in the French sugar colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved people rose up. They fought a 13-year war against 3 European empires and founded the second independent republic in the Western Hemisphere. They called it Haiti. In Virginia, white slave owners watched in horror. They read the newspapers. They listened to the refugees who arrived in Norfolk and Richmond with their stories of revolt. And they began to imagine the same thing happening to them. The third thing was Gabriel. Gabriel's planned uprising, betrayed by a storm and 2 informers, never killed anyone. But the white political class of Virginia treated it as if it had killed everyone. The legislature wrote laws. They restricted the movement of free black Virginians. They prohibited the education of enslaved people. They banned the assembly of enslaved people without white supervision. They tightened the rules around manumission. They began methodically to close every door that had been opened since 1782. By the time Gabriel was hanged, Carter had already done his work. The deed of gift was on the books. The manumissions were proceeding. But Carter had picked his moment perfectly without knowing it. If he had waited 5 more years, the same legislator that hanged Gabriel might have made the deed of gift legally impossible. Gabriel and Carter were not opposites. They were 2 responses to the same problem, written from opposite ends of the same room. Carter was a wealthy, white planter using a manumission statute. Gabriel was an enslaved blacksmith reaching for the same language of liberty that had carried Washington across the Potomac. They came at the problem differently, but both of them looked at Virginia in the 1790s and concluded that the institution at the center of it was wrong. Both of them expected white allies. Carter expected his peers, his neighbors, the men he had served with on the governor's council, to look at his example and follow it. Gabriel expected poor whites, immigrants, and dissenters to join his uprising. Neither of them got what they were waiting for. Carter's neighbors were silent. His family fought him in court. And the Yawp doesn't even mention him. Gabriel's white allies, whatever the trial records suggest about who they were too few to matter. The men who came when he called were enslaved, and they paid for it with their lives. That is the early republic the chapter is describing. Not just Jefferson in the president's house, not just the Louisiana Purchase or the slow march toward the War of 1812. Underneath all of it, the country was making a decision about what kind of country it was going to be. And in the years between 1791 and 1815, it decided. And what it decided shaped everything that came after. When you read Chapter 8 of the American Yawp, you are going to read about many people and events. Most of that material we have not touched on today. When you reach the section on Jefferson's presidency, slow down. Watch how the man who declared in print that black people were intellectually incapable of equality exercised the power of his office. Watch what he did, and watch what he did not do. Watch how his arguments about race traveled. And when you reach the section on Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, slow down again. The Yawp does a real job with these 2 brothers. Pay attention to what they were trying to build and to the spiritual tradition that produced them. We are going to come back to them later. And when you reach the War of 1812, ask yourself who fought it and who paid for it and what the people on this continent who were not white American citizens gained or what they lost in the result. And as you read, hold on to one other thing. The American Yawp is a good textbook. It is built by serious scholars. It is also, like every other textbook, a set of choices. Some stories are included, some are not. Robert Carter III is one of those who is not, but there are others. Read every chapter the way that you would read any other piece of writing, carefully, and with your own interpretations. Chapter 8 of the American Yawp is available for free at americanyawp.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel, and this has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyawp.com to access your free online copy of the American Yawp textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.